Hello. I am Ben Pick, and thank you for joining me in Running to Write, where I give questionable writing advice through writing metaphors. As a follow-up to an earlier video about what to do with a completed manuscript, I'm expanding on the step known as self-edits. Today I'll be showcasing a wonderful tool to help with that known as ProWritingAid. In case you're interested or have recently finished your own manuscript, you can check out my video on the first steps to take right here. To go along with the running metaphor, I'm returning to the example of the first run after finishing a marathon. After finishing that race, you should be doing what's called a recovery run, which is done at a lighter pace than normal and usually a shorter distance. This way you are stretching sore and overburdened muscles as you prepare for the next training cycle and big race. Stepping outside the running metaphor, this is similar to going from a completed manuscript to prepping to publish that novel, and that means it's time for self-edits. I think of myself as having a good understanding of the English language, but by no means am I an expert. That means I rely on software, critique partners, beta readers, and professional editors to fill in the gaps and catch what I miss. For software, I use ProWritingAid, which comes in at about $80 for an unlimited annual license. TLDR, it is well worth the cost. Oh, you want more details? Sure. These are my 5 pros and cons of using ProWritingAid, along with a little demo showing its user interface. The first positive thing I noticed about ProWritingAid came through how it flagged the dialogue in my manuscript. Due to the various versions and iterations of my manuscript and how I copied and pasted things back and forth between the various versions, the double quotes mark was inconsistently applied. And ProWritingAid was able to find each instance and mark it as a hanging open dialogue tag, which I really appreciated fixing because that would have looked really bad in print. Also, a substantial amount of the conversations within my manuscript were flagged for using informal phrasing. This was useful because it showed how the different characters were interacting, and if 2 friends were using informal phrasing, that's fine, but if, say, enemies or if students and teachers were using the same kind of phrasing, then that would not feel natural. I could tailor ProWritingAid to ignore this rule, but I liked having it flagged every single time because it showed potential conversations which should be touched up, especially if the speakers are enemies. Other flag conversations used roundabout speech patterns, which ProWritingAid gave explicit suggestions on how to fix. This trimmed word counts and streamlined sentences for my more egregious issues and made them much more readable. Within the first pass, ProWritingAid improved my story, and I was able to tailor its rules to continue making my story better. Pro number 2, made up words. Obviously, words I invent or unusual names and locations will be flagged. No tool could ever understand a word I made up without thinking that it's a spelling mistake. However, I added these words to ProWritingAid's dictionary so that whenever I used my names, locations, and abilities, they were no longer flagged. That way, when I misspell the words I invented, they were then highlighted. Pro 3, conscious bad decisions. There were a couple of instances across the manuscript where I intentionally used bad phrasing, which were flagged every time. For example, to make a point during a monologue, one of my characters used the same word to start off multiple sentences in a row. This was flagged for all 3 instances. Intentional cases where I broke standard usage guidelines should be flagged. This gave me an authorial choice. The tool highlighted where I wasn't using good writing practices, and I decided to ignore those instances and leave them as is. I want each instance flagged so that way I have to make a conscious decision to break good writing rules. As an example, ProWritingAid flags the word good, which I knowingly used within this video. This is what I want to have happen because good is rarely adequate to describe the scene or the situation. This is good. ProWritingAid enforces strong writing habits and makes me aware of every time I choose to ignore them. Pro number 4, speed. It analyzed my 97,000 word manuscript in less than 10 minutes, which is a completely reasonable amount of time. I wanted to show you a real-time upload of my manuscript, but at 10 minutes, that's not really great video content. And that would drag on a little bit too long. However, that is a perfect amount of time to get a cup of coffee or a stronger beverage if you so choose. I'm going to start this document from the very first step where I start a new file, this being the demo case of chapter 1, and then copy and paste it directly in. Here I have a version of my draft which was split into chapters. ProWritingAid can do that automatically, assuming you use standard formatting conventions. The analysis of a 2,000 to 3,000 word chapter is less than 10 seconds. So I highly suggest you also split a manuscript into its chapters. This will prevent a lot of the load time issues and potential crashes. Pro number 5, user friendly. I uploaded my manuscript and pressed go. ProWritingAid took care of the rest. It highlighted all the identified infractions, which I could expand on easily to understand the triggered rule and the recommended fix. This is like word spelling and grammar checks, but on steroids, and much, much more helpful. On the left side panel, you can see the various goals grouped according to what it thinks the fantasy metric should have, and then I can click over to see the improvements which are shown in the main page. Now this will rotate through. As you can see in chapter 1 there were 24 identified mistakes, and as I scroll through the page and scroll down, it highlights the exact instances and infractions on that given page. So I can then click on them to either accept them, learn more about what is triggering this rule, or ignore them entirely. You can see in the top right how there are 24 potential issues which ProWritingAid has identified. I can also look at the summary. I can do a whole bunch of different pieces to check and improve my overall metrics. Now, on the left side, you'll have this real-time panel, which you can click and turn on and off if you want, where it shows what you have currently, what you might want to work for. You can see that overall my sentence length is pretty good. My sentence variety, same. Most of these metrics are pretty good. The grammar, spelling, and style is a little bit lower than the 80% goal. However, there are quite a few misinterpretations which ProWritingAid has made. So you can see everything that it identifies as a mistake. You hover over it, and it tells you what it thinks it should be, what the rule is which triggers this, and you can see in this specific sentence how it says that there should be a comma after the word course. I've gone back and forth with multiple editors about this. Some of these are language preferences, some of them do sound better, some of them are better for language, but a lot of these ProWritingAid isn't necessarily getting correct. So this one, I think I actually put in the comma based on what ProWritingAid told me, and then an editor actually took it out. So I believe in this current version of the story, I'm just going to stick with going against what ProWritingAid says. Let me scroll down to a different instance which showed a couple of different things. So this one, it wants to break up a sentence into two different things, but I feel like that changes the meaning of what I'm trying to convey. So this one I'm also going to stick with. This one right here is one of the ones where ProWritingAid completely gets wrong. So we have returning the woods to relative silence, in my opinion, is the correct way of what I'm trying to convey. And because it's ProWritingAid is misinterpreting what it's reading, it wants to change the to the. So returning to the woods to relative silence, that completely changes what I have written. So that is not what I want to be in there. So in this case, and instances like this are negatively hurting me, but I still want to have it in here. I could always report it as incorrect, so that will help this percentage go up. So I think I'm going to do that to demo it. I'm probably not going to save this, or I'll re-import it later, so it won't really matter too much. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to just go ahead and say report incorrect. So cancel. And you can see now that I have jumped up to the 8% mark, and hey, that looks good to me. It's green. That looks lovely. So there's a lot that I can do there. Most of the issues are missing commas, which I have included, and then they've been taken out by editors. So at this point, I don't really know necessarily what the best move is to do with a lot of these cases, but you can scroll down and see what I have written. Some of the suggestions that ProWritingAid has made will change what the text is. So for example, right here, I wanted it to be that he started to move something rather than moved, and that is a stylistic choice that I'm intentionally making. So, you know, I could just hit another ignore because I want the rule to be there. I don't want to create a new instance. I definitely don't want to disable the rule, but I do want to ignore it here. And again, hey, look, I'm up to 81%. So a lot of what I do as I go through what I have written is to just say, hey, ignore this. And then when I refresh the page, those will come back, except for the one that I disabled. So I think I'm going to refresh the page, and that should drop this down to 80%. So let's try this out. So yeah, so this is reloading, and it's measuring everything out, and it's coming up with all of its metrics. So this should go back up to 81% and not 82%, because the one that I hit ignore on is back to, oh, okay, well, it's a little bit less than ideal, but yeah, is what it is. So let's see what else we can find in here. So echoes is one that I really like doing. Give it a second. But what I try and do is make sure that I'm not overusing certain phrases, that I don't repeat myself, that I am still using concise language while having sentence and word variety. Now, a lot of these repeats will be somebody's name, so that's perfectly fine. Along with the objects. I mean, this gives me less information, but this and this I might want to change. I don't necessarily know whether or not I like having making be in the same paragraph twice. So I will likely change this. On to the negatives. I'll start with con number 1, false positives. ProWritingAid had a high rate of false positives due in part to how it misinterpreted words with multiple meanings. Even though I have this as a negative, I'm also kind of using it as an example to improve my own diction and remove the instances of homonyms. I can't fault the tool as there's no good way of distinguishing these issues without missing legitimate problems. Con number 2, bland alternatives. Some of the suggestions ProWritingAid made created sentences that were more uniform and boring. For example, ProWritingAid wanted to uniformly change made no effort to into did not try, or had no idea into did not know. Another bland suggestion was to change indication into sign. The tool attempted to normalize specific words and unique phrasing by funneling variations into a standard format for readability. I accepted some of these changes but rejected most so that the manuscript wouldn't repeat itself. I outright disagree with ProWritingAid's preference of using only said or asked for dialogue tags. While I don't want to go overboard with muttered, announced, whispered, shouted, etc., I do believe there should be some variance. Con number 3, infinite loops and wrong answers. In a couple of cases, I was able to enter into infinite loops where the tool kept suggesting changes to its suggestions in a repeating pattern. Within my manuscript, the phrase comprised of 80s rock ballads was flagged twice. First, the tool wanted to change comprised of to consisting of, which it then wanted to change to comprising, which it then wanted to change to comprised of, and you see the problem. The second reason it was flagged was because it couldn't decide whether or not to add an apostrophe to 80s, which then triggered an infinite loop of suggestions. Then there were these suggestions which drastically altered the meaning. I had written managed to procure, which it wanted to change to procured, which it then wanted to change to bought. As the original implication was that the product was stolen, this changed the original intention. As time-consuming as it can be, I highly recommend reviewing every triggered alert individually and never automatically applying the suggested changes. Con number 4, fooling the matrix. Certain words can be considered nouns or verbs depending on their usage. In this way, I was able to get ProWritingAid to suggest the wrong instance of your because of how it was misinterpreting the sentence. My manuscript had the phrase, "You're way too chipper this morning," where I used YOU''RE, which is correct. However, ProWritingAid wanted to use YOUR because it kept thinking that way was a noun. And this leads right into my last negative for the tool, which is con number 5, software limitations. ProWritingAid is a tool and it cannot solve all the problems within your manuscript. It can teach you better grammar and improve your writing skills, but it's not a catch-all. My point is that a clean report from ProWritingAid doesn't mean that your manuscript is well written or free of grammatical issues. As someone who frequently uses a tool during my daytime job, I want to outright state that you need to be smarter than the tools. They are meant to perform a specific function, ideally faster than a person can. That is its purpose, speed and low-hanging fruit. ProWritingAid performs its usage and grammar checks well, but it is not a substitute for professional editors. I've already said this, but I'll say it again. Do not automatically apply these suggested changes. If you're unwilling to individually look at every single flagged alert, then you'll end up being no better than a broken AI, and your manuscript will suffer for it. In summary, ProWritingAid is an outstanding tool despite my nitpicks. I used it to vastly improve my manuscripts and get them ready for critique partners and beta readers, and it was fast and simple to apply. That makes this tool a perfect step 1 for self-edits, or a great sanity check after making all the changes based on a professional editor's comments. I am Ben Pick, and thank you for joining me in Running to Write. If you enjoy what I do here, then please help me do better according to YouTube software by pressing those like and subscribe buttons. Let me know in those comments about the oddest thing ProWritingAid or a similar tool has flagged for you. Do you agree with my opinions, or is everything I said wrong and you support our Skynet overlords? I post my running and writing progress on Instagram and Twitter, so be sure to follow me and join in with your own thoughts. See you next time. Until then, don't let computers take over the world, but do use them to improve your writing.